I call Phil Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's always a pleasure to follow the member David Bennett, a man whose rhetorical skills allow him to make even a taxation bill coma-inducing. Mr Speaker, I want to just, if I could just begin by putting onto the record some words of welcome to the 8 members of the Myanmar Young Leaders Program who are in the Parliament today and around the Parliament for a couple of days this week actually. 8 young leaders come from various backgrounds in Myanmar who are in New Zealand for a 6-month period learning about our democracy and our system of government, and many members around the House today have interacted with them and spent time with them. So I want to welcome those members and say how pleased we are to have them here in the New Zealand Parliament. Mr Speaker, this bill applies the 2-year so-called Bright Line test that the government announced as one of its 2 budget housing policies. And what it does is requires anybody who buys and sells a residential property within a 2-year period requires them to pay income tax on that. Furthermore, it requires all purchasers of residential property, including offshore speculators, to provide inland revenue with a bank account number, a New Zealand bank account number, and to register with IRD and get an IRD number. So I think it's a curious thing, Mr Speaker, that for a government that has spent the last few years denying, first that speculators are even a problem in the Auckland housing market, and secondly, that offshore speculators are even worth gathering information on. And Sarah, I've lost count of the number of times I've stood in this House and heard the Housing Minister, Nick Smith, get up and say, "Oh, it's the oldest trick in the book. The oldest trick in the book to blame the foreigner." I can't count the number of times Nick Smith has said that. In rubbishing the views of 85%, according to the most recent opinion survey, 85% of New Zealanders who think that offshore speculators should not be allowed to buy residential property in New Zealand because they are driving up house prices out of reach of ordinary New Zealanders. And this government has been in denial, complete denial, that it is even a problem. And they've stood here in this House, Mr Speaker, and accused us in the opposition benches of xenophobia because we've had the audacity to suggest that offshore speculators should not be allowed to buy and sell New Zealand homes for capital gain and make a profit and make a killing at the expense of young, hard-working Kiwi first home buyers. And it's been very clear, not only to us, sir, but to the rest of New Zealand, that this National Party government stands fairly and squarely on the side of speculators, both domestic and foreign. They do not stand on the side of hard-working young Kiwi first home buyers. And we've heard the most incredible litany of excuses, Mr Speaker. I agree, it's funny. I can't believe the government policy. I share your mirth.
Don't bring me into the debate, Mr Twyford.
All right, thank you, Mr Speaker, I won't. That we've heard Mr Nick Smith say that a register would be a distraction that would cost mega millions without doing a thing to tackle house price inflation. And yet, as my colleague Clayton Cosgrove points out, the requirement for offshore speculators to register with the IRD and provide a bank account is, as the Minister himself has conceded, is all about gathering information. Now, what is that if not a register? The Finance Minister is on the record saying that the point of this policy is to gather information. Having rubbished the idea for 2 years and having said consistently in this Parliament that foreign speculators are not a problem, we got this very curious backflip in the budget with the announcement of this policy in this bill. So why, I hear members ask, why does the government do such a backflip? Well, it's a very consistent pattern. that we've seen time and time again from this government. They deny and deny and deny it's a problem until the polls get to a certain point, and Stephen Joyce says to the Cabinet, look, we better do something about this. The overnight groups pretty worrying on this. Clearly we're losing support in Auckland, and in fact we know that 85%, according to the most recent poll, the most recent poll says that 85% of New Zealanders want to see foreign buyers banned from buying housing in New Zealand. So deny, deny, deny. The polls get to a certain point and then they do a little backflip, but it's just the bare minimum to make it look as if they're doing something. Just the bare minimum.
Not even that.
No, not even the bare minimum. How would you describe it?
I'd say it was utterly inadequate.
Well, it is. It's completely inadequate. And in fact, the government's own senior tax advisor, John Shewan, was in the paper a couple of days after this policy was announced, saying it wouldn't do a thing to deter speculators, and it wouldn't have any impact at all on Auckland house prices, which, by the way, Mr. Barclay, Auckland house prices went up $115,000 in the last 12 months on your government's watch. $115,000. The average Auckland house price is now in the region of $830,000. Under this government, a dream of affordable home ownership has completely gone down the gurgler. It is gone. It's a gone burger. So the question is, Mr. Speaker, is as inadequate as this bill is, as hopeless as it is, will it make a difference? Because after all, we are voting for it. So it's a fair question to ask, will it make a difference? Will it have any impact? Now, I've already quoted John Shewan, one of the most senior tax advisors that the government usually listens to, saying it won't have much of impact. Based on Treasury analysis from the last 3 years, our modelling shows that at best, the so-called 2-year bright line test will capture about 1,000 speculators. It will pull 1,000 speculators into IRD's dragnet, and on the same modelling suggests that it might bring in $18 million in extra revenue. Now that is pathetic, given the tens of thousands of houses that are sold every year in Auckland. It is a tiny fraction. So I think that you have to conclude, sir, that it won't do much, but it's better than nothing, but not by much. It's better than nothing, but not by much. And on those grounds, we will support it, because at least it is something. Why does this matter, Mr. Speaker? Why is it an important issue? And why do 85% of New Zealanders think this is a problem and that the government should regulate to ban offshore speculators? The reason is that the Auckland housing market under this government has been allowed to get completely out of control. And the other day, sir, I learned about a house in Massey in West Auckland that was bought 4 months ago for $385,000. The owner, the purchaser, slapped a coat of paint on that house and sold it 4 months later for $588,000. That is what's happening every day in the Auckland housing market. The census data showed there are 22,000 houses vacant on census night. Now, if you take out the houses that are in between tenants, if you take out the houses that are in the process of being bought and sold on that night, that would mean that there are about 15 to 16,000 houses vacant. These are what Aucklanders call ghost houses. And many of those I'm not talking about Nick Smith's, I'm not talking about his ghost housing policy. I'm talking about ghost houses that are lying vacant in Auckland because the speculators, many of them offshore, simply can't be bothered renting them out to tenants because they're making such a killing under this national government just by sitting on those houses for capital gain. That, sir, is how bad it's got in Auckland. I want to point to a story that appeared in the New Zealand Herald this week, reported on by Anne Gibson. The preeminent international Chinese website, Juai.com, that markets international real estate in countries like New Zealand to Chinese investors. It reported, sir, that based on the Chinese government's progressive dismantling of foreign exchange controls, which is something the Chinese government is committed to doing, has already begun and is committed to doing over the next 10 years, Juai.com predicted that $15 billion of Chinese investment will be heading the way of the New Zealand real estate market over the next few years. New Zealand is set to get more than 3% of all the Chinese investment, sir. There is a tsunami of Chinese investment coming into the Auckland real estate market. This government is in denial. This measure, Mr. Speaker, will not make the slightest bit of difference. But we will vote for it to the Select Committee because at least it's a tiny step in the right direction.